All right, let's go ahead and get started. I do not want to take away our valuable time from our discussion today as we provide this update. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So next slide, please, Stephanie. Thank you. So we're going to be providing some opening and welcome remarks. So welcome, everyone. We're so happy to see you here again on this summer day, and we hope you've had as pleasant summer as possible. We will then transition into a presentation on what has reviewing what we discussed back in April and providing an update of where this effort and this work has gone forward. And then we'll begin our question and answer session to ask any burning questions you may have and really highlight where we hope to have identified areas of opportunity for continued engagement with the persons with lived experience community in ALS. And finally, we will wrap up. Next slide. So today it will be myself, Michelle Campbell, and my colleague from the Critical Path Institute, Dr. Cheryl Kuhn, from the Clinical Outcome Assessment Program, that we will be presenting and discussing this ongoing effort that we've been doing, reviewing from the literature current clinical outcome assessments that have been used in the ALS space, both in clinical trials based on what is currently in the published literature. Next slide. So as a reminder, our overview and really our question that we wanted to ask was, how do we get fit for purpose clinical outcome assessments that are meaningful to people with lived experience? And really what we want to know is what is that missing information for these clinical outcome assessments to be considered fit for purpose? Fit for purpose is a term that we use at FDA when we are reviewing the evidence of clinical outcome assessments. And to be fit for purpose, it needs to include a multitude of various evidence and data information collected, including qualitative work and quantitative work. Qualitative work is critically important as it establishes something called content validity that typically comes from persons with lived experience, as well as other key opinion leaders for diseases and disorders, but is ultimately critically important for us in the reflection of the questions that are going to be selected in the clinical outcome assessments. Our goals of this project was to identify concepts that are meaningful to persons with lived experience, identify tools that measure those concepts, and assess the need for further development of the tools for use in clinical trials. And ultimately, what we would hope is that these tools could be used to support clinical trial endpoints. Next slide. So since our last session that we presented in April, we asked for feedback from you, and you've provided us with some questions. These questions we hope will answer through our presentation today, but we will come back to them at the end of our presentation to make sure that we have answered them directly. And we thank you for these questions, as they are extremely thoughtful and very informative to us as we move this effort forward. Next slide. So as a refresher, we shared you this slide back in April, and it is a very busy slide. So I wanted to take a few moments to refresh what was actually going on with this effort and how we are applying our goals to what we talk about a lot in measurement in clinical outcome assessments for regulatory purposes under patient-focused drug development. What you see in front of you is a roadmap. This roadmap is the hallmark of any type of measurement development for clinical outcome assessments to be used to support clinical trial endpoints. Particularly, obviously, this is coming from our patient-focused drug development guidance series. And this roadmap has been developed after years of experience of development of clinical outcome assessments, bringing into the critical and key aspects of patient-focused drug development and incorporating the patient voice and their families' voices as appropriately in clinical outcome assessment development. And how do we take this to develop our fit-for-purpose COAs? So our first goal, if we start all the way to the far left, is really this understanding of disease or condition. And so our first goal that we wanted to accomplish was to do a landscape analysis to see what in the literature says are the concepts that are being measured in clinical trials. And so with this, we were able to begin the process of understanding not only the disease, but also the concepts and understanding the concepts that are important to patients. The second goal was with the gap analysis was to evaluate existing evidence from existing clinical outcome assessments. And this is critical for us to understand, are there gaps in this evidence that is needed in order for something to be fit for purpose? Or are we actually measuring something incorrectly, or we've completely forgotten a critical, important concept that is relevant and should be explored? The third goal of the project, as we see it being fit into this roadmap, is the recommendations to fill in those gaps. And that is what we're really going to be discussing a little bit more today. This roadmap is what we talk about a lot in COA development. And I think it's really great that we are actually showing what we talk about through this effort of how to actually operationalize our patient-focused drug development roadmap. Next slide. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Cheryl Kuhn, who's going to be discussing the actual results from the gap analysis and what we've learned from there and our next steps. Cheryl?
Thank you, Michelle, and hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here today, and so glad to see so many of you that can attend this second session. We will be recapping some things that we presented in April, and so this slide is one of those things, but then we'll build from that and tell you where we are. So going back to where we were in April, we had started with that large literature review that Michelle mentioned on the previous slide. We identified 437 publications from that literature review. And so that's a lot to sift through. We got it down to 88 based on the relevance of what it is that we were trying to answer from those articles. And from those 88 articles, we were able to produce a list of 176 descriptive concepts that describe the patient-centered health experience. From those concepts, we grouped them into big buckets of domains. So activities of daily living, that obviously has a lot going on in there, but we can kind of group things together in commonalities to describe them a little bit more easily across those studies. From that list of 20, we needed to go through them in a critical manner and think about not only is it representing the experience of people who are having these experiences on a daily basis, but can they be used to understand if a new therapy is actually improving or if the new therapy is providing stability? And those are the types of concepts that we need to prioritize for clinical trial endpoints. It doesn't mean that things that don't make it into clinical trial endpoints aren't important, but it's that kind of the deciding if that therapy is the thing that helped. And so from that 20, we ended up with this list here. And these are the things that are really kind of proximal to the therapy itself, the things that new therapies, and we're not thinking about a specific one, we're just thinking in general, as things are developed, how will we know that those new things are actually helping? And so this is the list of concepts that we narrowed that literature review down to that might be useful for supporting clinical trial endpoints. These are the things that can connect that dot between how people are feeling and functioning and how a new therapy might work in action. So this list is really what we were using to drive forward. It's based on the literature where so much research has already been done. And people, these researchers have gone out and done qualitative work to find out what's important, what are the impacts, and that's how we ended up with this list. So from there, once we identified what are the things that according to the literature need to be measured, we could actually then map that onto the tools that are already available. So on the next slide, please. There's a lot going on this slide. We have on the left-hand column a list of tools that we identified as the most viable. So we actually found 112 measures tools in the literature search, but only 23 of them were developed specifically for use in an ALS population. And we know it's certainly possible to take a tool that was developed elsewhere and adapt it for use in a new population. But We wanted to focus in on the things that were really derived from the ALS community, the ALS voices, and make sure that that was reflected in the tools that we kind of dug deeper into. So from those 23, we narrowed it down just kind of based on, are the concepts relevant from the previous slide? Were they developed for kind of this purpose of clinical research? And we got to this top 10 list. I will notice, and I mentioned this in April, that the ALS FRS is not in our list because we actually know a lot about it already. So we didn't want to spend time and energy on digging into an instrument that already has a lot of evidence that has already been compiled. We wanted to go into these instruments that are being used in, say, the all ALS natural history study and in other research contexts to be able to determine if they have the type of evidence that would be needed for regulatory endpoint use. So they're being used elsewhere for sure in all sorts of research settings. But really thinking back to that roadmap that Michelle presented, where we want to get to that end goal of a fit for purpose instrument where we know we can leverage data from it in clinical trials. So we went with this top list of 10. Here we have listed the concepts that are included in these instruments. And so part of this process is mapping these back to that previous slide and making sure that we've got the coverage that we need. In that process, we might identify things that aren't existing in current instruments, and maybe we need something new, and that's really informative. But within the ones that do exist, the ones that are ready to go off the shelf, how much confidence can we have that we're measuring the right thing in the right way? So I want to go to the next slide to start to dig into that question. So this is where the new stuff comes from since April. A full gap analysis was done on those 10 instruments. And in a gap analysis, we're trying to identify evidentiary gaps that might exist for the tools that we're considering. And the columns here are those buckets of information we were looking for. So I'm going to walk through them one at a time to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking for when we're thinking about fit for purpose instruments. And then I'll start to populate this table and show you what we found. So on the left-hand side, we start with concept elicitation, where we find out directly from the people with that lived experience, what are the concepts that are meaningful to you in your life? What are the things that you want to see improved, you want to see stable, the things that make a difference? And so in these research settings, often they start with concept elicitation, and it means that we have tied the content of that instrument back to the people who are the experts and who should be driving that content. From there, once the items start to get generated, there's a process of cognitive debriefing where we go back to the people with the experience and the people who would be responding to the questions and find out, do the questions make sense? Are they worded in a way that it's easy to provide a response to them? Is there anything that's unclear? Is there anything that's missing? Maybe there was something that didn't come up in concept elicitation, but really should have been in there. And now we get that chance to add it in before we get too far down the line. So those two columns, I have them with a red box around them because that's where the experience from patients or from people with lived experience needs to be provided in there, that direct feedback where there's engagement with the researchers and the experienced people to be able to say, you've got the content right, you've got the item wording right, and then we can carry forth to the rest of the research. So the rest of the stuff in this table is very much quantitative in nature. And so it's based on responses that would be provided on the items, but not necessarily in like a one-on-one interview setting. More, you fill out the questionnaire and then it gets statistically analyzed to understand patterns within there. The structure bucket, we're wondering, do the items really relate to each other in a way that we can add them together or somehow compile a score from them that means something? That's really important because once you go from a set of items and start putting them together, that score can get really mushy and not very interpretable. So we've got to make sure that there's evidence that we've put them together in a wise way, and the score means something. We can interpret it at the other end. We look at things like internal consistency, saying, again, those items do belong together to form a score. Test retest reliability, which means over time, if one of those concepts is stable, somebody's experiencing stability, are the scores actually reflecting that stability? That's really important, because if there's kind of noise going on in there, we want to know so that we can account for that, or maybe improve the item, write it in a better way so that we get stable responses when things are stable. When things change over time, that's ability to detect change, and we want to know that too. So if somebody is improving over time, the scores also show that. And then the construct validity bucket has a lot of stuff in there. It's, can we distinguish between people who are truly different on that concept? Are the scores on that concept related to other things that are similar? So that is a big list of psychometric properties, which really excite me because I am a psychometrician. And we looked into the literature in this gap analysis to see what evidence is out there. Did they start with people with lived experience? Did they get that perspective when they were creating the items? Did they do psychometric analysis in an ALS population where you've got the statistics coming out and those statistics are saying good things in these buckets? And let's click to the next slide and we can start to populate this table. So for the first kind of the highest tier that we were looking for is where, yes, the researchers did that due diligence. We have good evidence that's in the published literature, and we have confidence that we've got good evidence for these buckets. For these 10 instruments, there are unfortunately only 2 solid green checkboxes for that. We have solid internal consistency for the ALS AQ40 and solid test retest reliability for the roads. Let's click one more time and add some light green to this table. The light green is showing adequate evidence. And I do have a question mark there, because in some cases, the publication said, yes, we did concept elicitation interviews and we generated the concepts from the people with that experience. But the publication may not have given enough evidence that would be ready to kind of hand over and say, we've got our trial endpoints. So these light green boxes, the way I'm looking at them is that there's a lot of promise here. We think that these instruments are on the right track when it comes to these buckets, but we need to double check it. That might mean going to those researchers and saying, can you give us some more information about how you did the concept elicitation or what the construct validity looked like? Because we want to start to package that together so it would be ready for some sort of regulatory review down the road. So the light green is definitely promising. And the question mark, I think, is maybe it's just a pause. It's saying, let's find out more, but we think they're on the right track. Let's click one more time, and then we'll fill out the rest of the table, which shows up with, unfortunately, a lot of orange. And these are cases where the evidence is weak or it just does not exist, at least in the literature. Now, it might exist with the researchers on their own desktops at their homes. So we may need to go to them and say, hey, did you actually do this stuff? We didn't see it in your publication, but perhaps you did it and we want to know about it. So we have some more due diligence to do here in terms of finding out if the gaps are truly gaps or if it's just they haven't been published. Some of these instruments are pretty new, and that means that they haven't gotten the evidence out there yet. So while this table is maybe a little scary in terms of not enough green and too much orange, some of these boxes might change. We might be able to flip them to green by finding out from those researchers, or by generating new evidence ourselves. So we have some of these instruments that are in the natural history study or in other ongoing studies. And the stuff on the right-hand side here, we can do psychometric analysis on those and find out if maybe in a different sample, it actually shows up differently. Perhaps they have different variables or a different study design that says, actually, we have good reliability and validity. It just wasn't shown previously in maybe a small study. On the left-hand side, again, that red box is back up, and that's where some of these things we do need to go back and find out from the people with lived experience. Are the concepts what matter, and are the items written in the right way? So we know we have some gaps that we can fill with that type of research. And that can involve a standalone study where we have a study that's been designed with a protocol and an interview guide, make sure we're asking the right questions in the right way, and that we've got IRB review for making sure that we're approaching that study in the right way. But this is also the place where maybe you have some thoughts here. And so on the previous slide was the list of questionnaires. There are hyperlinks on all of those. And so when you get these slides after this call, you can click through on those hyperlinks and look at them yourselves. You can say, this doesn't make sense to me, or the concepts just aren't really covering the things that I'm experiencing. And in this setting, we've got that email address that we'll show in a couple of slides. That might be something that you want to contribute as an engaged research partner here. But to really, truly fill these buckets, we do have some additional work to do in terms of study design. And prior to that, reaching out to those the researchers and making sure there isn't something we've missed. So let's go to the next slide, which is kind of the next steps and what we have found. So as I said, the gap analysis did highlight a common theme, and that's that the developers, they seem to have failed to speak with the people with lived experience. That means the instruments might be useful, but they also might not actually be mapping onto what's important. So this is where, as research partners in this consortium effort, you can provide that feedback. If you look at those and you have something that you want to comment, please feel free to share that with us, and we would incorporate that into kind of our next steps in figuring out what those gaps really do look like. We do need to make sure that those measures that could be used in clinical trials are measuring what's important and relevant to you, as well as the larger community. So we now have to do some more work to figure out, how are we going to structure these conversations? We need to figure out kind of the funding source to be able to design a study and what that study should focus on. We don't want to just plop all 10 instruments into a future study, because we want to make sure we're spending our time and resources in where it really has good viability. So we're having those conversations offline and making sure that we're picking the right tools going forward. And if the tools don't exist, that's also something we need to know, because then it might mean developing new ones. So going back to that earlier slide, we don't have to flip there, but just thinking about that big slide of yellow boxes, if there are things that are on that slide that aren't in the instruments, that might be where we need a new tool. Could be also that new tools are being developed. And so every day we're kind of paying attention to what's going on. And if something comes along, we'll add that into our queue for kind of assessment. As I mentioned, after we confirm that content, we might still need to do additional psychometric analysis to fill some of those gaps that were on the right-hand side of that table. We want to see if we can turn some of those oranges to green. That would mean if we can fill a row of green, that means it's probably an instrument we can take forward in a clinical trial setting. If we do this additional work and it stays orange, that means it probably can't go forward. And that's why we want to make sure we're only investing in the ones that really are the right ones to try to get that additional evidence for. And if in that list of 10, we know it's not something we should push forward, then we would move on and spend the resources elsewhere. Again, it might be revision, it might be new stuff. So from there, let's go to the next slide. This slide has that email address where if you are looking through these slides and clicking on those instruments and thinking about your own experience, please share that at that email address. We want to hear from you as our engaged research partners and as people who are the experts in this. We need to hear your voices. We want to hear your voices in this process. We've done all that literature review, due diligence to kind of set the foundation. And now you can reflect on that and let us know if we've hit the mark or if there are some things that aren't reflective of your own experience. Let's go to the next slide, which should be the questions that we received after the April meeting. And I'd like to invite Michelle to rejoin me on the screen. And we'll go through these questions. You know, we looked at these before we prepared these slides, and we wanted to try to address them in the presentation, and then also know we need to kind of maybe elaborate on some, or some just weren't going to get covered there. So for the first one, it appears that this work was conducted without people with lived experience involvement. How do we get more directly involved with the work in producing this type of information? Hopefully that's one that has been answered now. So we've got the email address from the previous slide. You know, it's important to say that we have not had that involvement day in, day out, because we had to do our due diligence to be able to have that foundation. And rather than making you do all the work, we needed to do that work to be able to have kind of a common set of things to reflect on. And now it's time to get that direct involvement. So you're absolutely invited to submit information through that email address. And then on the next one, is there a timeline for how and when people with lived experience will have opportunities for involvement? What timeline do we expect for additional feedback? And how and when will you learn about opportunities and outcomes along the way? I touched on that a little bit in terms of the things that we know we need to start planning in terms of research, and the fact that we don't have a timeline. We are starting to set that timeline now that this stage of the study has wound down. But I want to hand it to Michelle to add any flavor there if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. So obviously, the slide with all the different colored boxes, as I like to describe it, really reflects that patients with lived experience is the critical unmet need in a lot of the currently existing patient-reported outcomes, that which all of those were outcome assessments. There is a great need for that information. And so for really first to better plan how to proceed forward, we are going to be now needing to standardize and develop actual research protocols and have to go through human subjects protections and IRB to really begin to start that qualitative research in a rigorous way. We want to make sure that we are utilizing the time of persons with lived experience to its best to be. We don't want to waste your time and just ask some questions that may not be informative. We really want to make sure that we are taking our time to develop the protocols, to ask the questions, to get the best responses. And then that information that we collect can be useful in order to fill those gaps and to help support either the existing instruments that are out there, or perhaps build on to saying we need something new. And so we really want to make sure we apply the correct rigor that is needed, but also make sure that we're not going to be wasting anyone's time and energies in participating. And we know that you want to participate. You're an extremely active group, and I appreciate that so much, because and we know that. And so we want to make sure that we are going to do everything correctly in a manner that's going to be extremely informative to all stakeholders. So our next question is, what scales outside of the ALS FRS are being used to evaluate, and how successful are they? So hopefully that's a great question. And that was actually the big portion of that second step of the gap analysis that Cheryl explained. So we're not focusing on the ALS FRS in this effort. We want to look at other clinical outcome assessments that are hopefully capturing the entire broader lived experience. And that can be through a couple instruments or maybe a single instrument. And so what we've shown is, at least from the literature, we have a lot of missing gaps. And so that is why this was really, really important to make sure we understand and what to really carry forward, and what are those gaps that need to be addressed. This is important because not only is your lived experience critically important and a massive unmet need as shown, but this also can demonstrate to industry and measurement developers what additional evidence is still needed. And so if they were to incorporate this into their clinical trial, what would be the evidence that we need to help support these clinical outcome assessments to support those trial endpoints? So this is really meant to be extremely informative to all stakeholders in drug development. Another great question, because it is definitely a very popular conversation that is occurring right now in ALS, as well as other rare neurodegenerative diseases, is the utility of digital health technologies. And so we absolutely agree that digital health technologies in ALS is going to be critically important, and particularly in measuring concepts that we cannot measure well in other ways. Right now, while you do not see any mention of DHTs, it does not mean we're ignoring them. We are very much fully engrossed in looking at them, and that is a different work stream actually that's occurring in the COA endpoints working group. It has just really been brought in a good way, and so we have began a quick lit search of what's there. We've also been cataloging known existing data, and I think those who may be on the call who are contributing data to this effort. We definitely think that digital health technologies will have an appropriate role to support digitally derived endpoints, but they could also support a digitally derived biomarker, and that is where we're really right now exploring the data that is being contributed to this effort about what can the really data tell us, how is the data really looking, and what are those lessons learned. When we embark in a new area, particularly when it comes to technology, we know that we need to learn from what's there to better apply it. And so while I know there's high hopes that DHTs will quickly answer our questions, we do need to take our due diligence in reviewing and understanding the data and really seeing what the capabilities are with the current data and how that can inform for maybe more optimized data collection and or the use of these digital health technologies. So we are fully supportive of the use of DHTs, and I do personally think that they're going to be critically important in our rare neurodegenerative diseases. I do think they're going to be critically important in ALS as well, and so we want to take our time to make sure we understand that, and perhaps we can have some further discussions as that is moving along, as that is really just in its infancy at this moment. But please don't think that we've forgotten about it. It is a constant conversation. We had another great question, because simultaneously while we were doing this, the AMP-ALS effort was launched, as well as the natural history study out of NIH called All ALS. And so the question is how are we working with those efforts? So we are working very closely with those efforts. A lot of this working group falls under not just CPR&D, but as well as a working group for AMP. As well as we were in contact during our gap analysis as the protocol for all ALS was being developed. And we have included clinical outcome assessments, which are all PROs that are going to be included in the all ALS natural history study. So there are about 3 to 4 instruments that are being used that we have kept on our list. And so what we are hoping is our goal is that from the data that's being collected, that data will be shared with the Critical Path Institute, and we can then do what Cheryl's real focus is taking the quantitative information and seeing if it can help inform some of those areas of gaps for those scales that are being currently used. So yes, we definitely worked closely as that protocol was being developed to see how we could leverage and help inform. Another effort that will also be helping, that we've helped discuss with the natural history study, is really the exploration of clinical meaningfulness and having some understanding of that with the scales and how can they help in that information and data collection as well. So we are working closely. We want to leverage all possibilities to collect data that can help inform the data gaps we have. And finally, and I think this is a great question, I think whoever submitted it, I do know, we always know this and we hear this so much, and I know it's true among many rare neurodegenerative diseases, but I know how hard it is in ALS personally with the delay or slow diagnosis of ALS for families, for persons who've been diagnosed. And the question is which of these measures can best perhaps help the earlier diagnosis so there's more opportunities to participate in trials? I think it's a great question. Unfortunately, at this time, we don't know if any of these clinical outcome assessments would be able to help and assist in an earlier diagnosis. I think for earlier diagnosis is where we need to focus on a multi-pronged approach with the understanding disease, biomarker work, as well as what could be some type of prognostic methodologies to help with that earlier diagnosis. But I want to acknowledge that we very much are aware of that. But at this time, we just do not have the evidence that would suggest that there would be something that could assist in that. Perhaps once we have better data in some of these outcome assessments, we may be able to do that. But at this point, our focus is really on the trial endpoints. However, if the data we do collect could be informative for other purposes, that would be great. And so we are not dismissing this, but just know that at this time, we really don't have a good answer to that question, unfortunately. So with that, I don't know if Cheryl, if you have anything you want to add to what I've said over the last couple of questions before we turn it over to Tom for the Q&A.
I think you hit it well. I've been trying to monitor the Q&A. We do have questions coming in already, and I have flagged a few that I'm ready to answer live. Michelle, you might want to take a look at that list. And I will say I've got reports that are open on my desktop so that I can make sure I'm answering specific questions accurately. So that's why I'm kind of looking around here. So Tom, do you want to go ahead and kind of field this portion?
Sure thing. Thanks to you both. Great information so far. And there are some fantastic questions coming in. Cheryl, if you would like, I will go through and we can begin with the questions that you flagged already, and then we'll just move through the remainder. So let's start with goal number one. Regarding goal number one, why isn't speech a bucket? I think that's back to one of the earlier slides where we were talking about the goals of this work.
Yeah, that's in slide 7. And if it's easy to find slide 7, we can just pull that up and address that quickly. There we go. Thank you. So speech is in the bulbar bucket. And so these buckets have a lot of stuff going on in there. And in the report, when I look at the bulbar bucket, it's a long list of things that fit into that. And in fact, the entire table that describes what is comprised within each of these squares is pages and pages long, which is why it didn't end up on a slide. Michelle, I don't think we talked about disseminating this information specifically, but we will be, we plan on publishing this and making it publicly available because we have done so much work here. Our research partners have done so much work. We need to get this out there for other people to use. And we also need to get it out there for transparency. And so that type of information would be available within there. So when you look at these big buckets and you think, well, this thing is not represented in there, it might be. And we need to make sure that we're able to kind of share what comprises each of these squares. So I think Michelle and I can take that offline in terms of, is there a way to get that information out there more quickly than a peer-reviewed publication, which takes forever? Because that is important for your understanding of how it is that we came up with these groups. Michelle?
Yeah, I just want to add, we very much recognize at the FDA, and I would say in all stakeholder groups in drug development, that speech is a big deal in the ALS community. And so we are very much interested in the bulbar aspects. We know that those are some of the really hard concepts to measure with a more traditional clinical outcome assessment. And as I said, I do think that this may be where our DHT aspects can really help us, and we're exploring that right now. So please know that this, for us at FDA, we are very much consciously aware of this, and are hopeful that we can find something that we can really measure the speech aspect, because we do know what that means to families. And so we obviously want to make sure we can continue exploring how can we really measure that concept, the aspects of speech, in a way that is clinically meaningful and that we can interpret and actually be able to describe if successful in a clinical trial. through data interpretation and how we collect that data. So I want to let you know that we are very much aware of that, and we are also trying to explore options to be able to best measure.
Great, thank you. So next question, this one is for Michelle. It seems like surveys or questionnaires only made the list of tools. Were there any objective tools that were evaluated?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And there was actually two questions that were kind of like this that talked about more objective measures, including FVC and grip strength. And so, yes, this effort was focusing on clinical outcome assessments, as those are the ways that we directly can measure clinical benefit in our trials. And so clinical benefit is defined as an improvement in how a patient feels, functions, and survives. And so our clinical outcome assessments are our best way to actually be able to capture that. The objective measures that have been listed are very important and are seen in clinical trials. What we need, and they can be used as somewhere in an endpoint hierarchy, depending on the conversation that a sponsor can have with us. But sometimes those measures, while we may see improvement in some of those things, we have to make sure that it does translate to clinical meaningfulness. And so sometimes, even if we may see an improvement in grip strength, which we know is really important from a dynamometer, we want to make sure that is translation to an improvement in function, for example. Also, with some of these other objective measures, we do make sure that we bring in our additional internal expertise in disease areas that may have additional thinking about approaches. So we definitely recognize it. They are incorporated, they are important, but the focus here was really on the ways that we're going to be measuring clinical benefits through our clinical outcome assessments for endpoints. But those objective measures are being used and can be used, and are hopefully part of discussions that industry is having when they come and get advice from us.
Great, thank you. And Cheryl, this question is for you. Are any of these PRO measurements?
Yes. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. All right. So I'm going to map my very long report table onto this table. So starting with the ALS AQ40, that's a patient-reported outcome measure, as well as the 5-item version. The 5-item is a smaller version of that larger instrument that was meant to kind of cut down on items that we can get good assessment out of just those 5. The ALS cognitive behavior screen. This would be an easier activity if these were alphabetical. That one it's actually a combination. It's a performance outcome measure as well as an observer reported instrument. So we've got some mixture there. For the aims, and there's probably some of these you all know better, off the top of your head, and you can probably name them out before me. That one's a patient reported outcome measure. The ALS SS is a clinician reported measure. The CNS scales, Michelle, you might be able to chime in on that one. Alphabetical would be helpful.
Alphabetical would be. Oh,
those are ClinROs, aren't they?
Yes, they are. The clinician reported outcome.
The bulbar one, it says it's patient reported, so it might be a combination. The Edinburgh scale is somewhere on the list. That one, that's the combination, the performance outcome and the observer outcome measure. Mm-hmm. Then the mind and the roads, patient reported outcome. So the point here is that we've got the patient reports, we've got clinician reports, we've got observer reports, and we've got performance outcome measures. And this is in addition to the whole stream of work that we're considering in DHTs. All of those things together can actually really paint a comprehensive picture. And so we absolutely want to have patient reported outcomes, because that's providing that information directly from the person who's experiencing it. And the other information can also be assessed in an equally reliable and valid way. and they all complement each other. So we're not necessarily prioritizing one over the other, and we're considering as many different tools as we can from those different resources.
Thank you. Michelle, this next question is for you. Do any of these tools address ALS heterogeneity and their scoring?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so I would say right now, that is what we need to figure out in those measurement gaps that we have with the scoring and really the performance. And so that is why if we can make sure, particularly with leveraging the natural history study and the instruments that are being included in there, because that will be much more heterogeneous than perhaps a clinical trial. That can actually help us really understand how the items perform and if the scoring can be useful in some way to help manage heterogeneity. So that's a really great question. It's an area that we need to continue to look at. And I think that's what we would love to do with seeing some of this data that does come in to help with that. We do understand the heterogeneity aspect. It is something that is across the board for us in neurology and in most of our diseases and disorders. And so we do have some ways of looking at that, understanding that. And I think that's why it's also very important that when we are talking to persons with lived experience like yourselves, it is important for us to understand what is that heterogeneity looks like and how much of that variability is. There could be small amounts of heterogeneity in that lived experience, but we can still measure that overall concept somewhat and be able to accept some of that noise perhaps in an instrument. But if we do have such broad, diverse experiences on certain concepts, I think we would have to really think about what is the best way to measure that and how do we really balance that. So it's a great question. I think it is something that we hope from data that could be collected prospectively can really help address that. And I don't know, Cheryl, if you have any thoughts on that from a more quantitative perspective, but I know you would agree with me that this is a big area of unmet need, and we are hopeful that we can get some data to help with that.
Yeah, I'll just add that in that table, the structure column is where that would come in, and understanding what I discussed earlier is that do the items go together? But if they are actually going in different directions because of heterogeneity, that's also something that would be assessed there. And that would need to be accounted for in the scores, because if we just score things without thinking about that, the scores wouldn't be reflective of what's actually happening. And so that's something that would be considered and should be reported in the literature. It's just kind of mushed together into that one column, but really a really critical thing to consider.
And Michelle, another one for you. Are there larger phase 3 trials that are using ALS-AQ40 or ROADS, which can help validate or fill in the table that Cheryl was showing earlier?
Yeah, great question. So while I can't talk about specific drug development programs, I can say that we highly encourage the use of other clinical outcome assessments into ALS trials that are ongoing, as well as if any stakeholders that are exploring to pursue either additional natural history stuff or any observational studies may want to consider if they can incorporate this. That data will really help us in answering some of these questions. I will say that some of the sensitivity to detect change, as well as some meaningfulness work, we do know that will really either have to come from extremely lengthy natural history studies that can kind of build in that natural progression, and or from our clinical trials directly. I think we are hopeful with through data sharing, and if we can get prior clinical trials that may have had these assessments in there, we can start looking at that data to start addressing some of those gaps if it is existing. So I would just encourage folks to see if it's being included in the trials, if they're being asked about trials, but also if you have data on these instruments and we consider data sharing, that can also help identify these gaps. Remember, these gaps is what was identified so far from the literature. And so that may mean there could be someone who has data and we're just not aware of it because it's not been made public through publications at this point.
Thanks. And Michelle, one more for you. Improved breathing isn't important to clinical benefit?
Yeah, Yeah, oh yes, it's definitely an improved clinical benefit. And so when we look at our endpoint hierarchies and we're looking at everything that's being collected, so the clinical outcome assessment, the biomarkers, objective measures, all of these things together, we're looking at all of those endpoints together to really look at overall efficacy and what's happening. So yes, that is obviously very meaningful and very, very important. So it would be a clinical benefit, but we do also look at everything else as well to see what's going on. So yes, very important.
And then our last submitted question, right about on time, given that disease progression and functional decline are separated, how can we ever find a suitable clinical outcome outside something like survival?
Yeah, and I'm really glad we got to this question, Tom, and I really thank Jean for asking that question. This is, I will say right now, the fundamental question we get every day in all of our progressive neurodegenerative diseases, whether you're rare or not. This is the question that we get, and I'm going to say some stuff, and then I don't know if Cheryl's got some thoughts about this from a measurement perspective, but I would say this is my everyday. This is something that we think about every day. How do we balance this, right? Because we need to make sure we have long enough trials to get the data we need to be able to make a regulatory decision, but also at the same time, making sure that we are getting things out that are going to be impactful to patients and their families. I think like I sometimes think of this in drug development in two ways. So if we're looking at a symptomatic therapy, so something that is going to focus on a single symptom, I think when it comes to endpoints, we're going to be looking at a change in that symptom, hopefully a decrease of that symptom. But I think where the real conversation is these days, and I know a lot of you have been a part of these and the many meetings that I do attend for the various patient groups, is really these, for lack of a better word, disease modifying therapy. So how can we slow progression or delay a transition to a new stage? And that is a much different trial design. And I think our approaches of how do we really try to assess our endpoints is a continued conversation with us. So that is why we do encourage to come and have those conversations early. That's why we really try to think hard about when we're selecting things to measure in your clinical trial. We will kind of think of across the board of what can we capture, how will this be informative to us? And so we do really try to take a broad approach when possible. Again, it will be always dependent upon what is the drug supposed to do and what is that trial design that's being proposed. But we understand that we have to balance how long will it take to be able to start seeing that change, as well as that trial design, as well as what do we need to get out to patients if we're successful. So please know that we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of good. Hopefully I said that correctly and in the right order. Cheryl will tell me if I said it backwards. But I think we do really make sure that we can find suitable outcomes that will work in our progressive neurodegenerative diseases and in those clinical trials. But Cheryl, do you have any thoughts on that?
Michelle, you said that very well. The only thing I'll just add from that measurement perspective is that some of these measures might be good in one clinical trial and not another clinical trial. And so we're looking at this kind of agnostic to the therapy that would be evaluated, because we don't have one in our pockets to be thinking about. Other people are working on those. We're thinking, okay, when they're ready to set up a trial, what does their trial design look like? What population are they researching? And what do they expect to happen over the course of the trial? And then we'd have a list of instruments that could be potentially used. And that list might differ depending what that trial design looks like.
Great, thank you both. So I think there's a summary, a thank you slide with some links and email address. So very quickly, I'll just remind everybody, this covered a lot of material. This recording will be available on our website. We're going to share the slide deck, so you'll be able to review it on your own time. Please feel free to share feedback at that email address using the subject link that was shared. And again, thank you for these many great questions and participating in the discussion. I appreciate everybody's time and thoughtfulness. And we will continue to be in touch with additional steps as this research moves forward.
Thank you, everyone, for your time today.